Do you remember the first time you picked up a camera?
I do. I have a little photograph of it, and it's me and Therese, who was a friend of my parents. And there's a picture of me with this. It's not a box brownie, but it's one level up from that. And you can see me kind of struggling with the controls. And I guess I must have been 3, something like that, you know. And then later on, I picked up my father's. He had this Kodak camera that had the bellows that opens up and the bellows stick out, and I did a lot of my early work with that camera.
And why not keep it as a hobby? How did you? So many kids pick up gadgets of all sorts. Why continue on?
I suppose it was kind of in the family because my father worked for the BBC. He was a drama producer, and he was one of the pioneers of 3-camera drama, and he produced about an hour of live television every week. And even though I could see the stress on his face, you know, it was definitely an area that I was going into. Some of my earliest memories of my father was he would come home and he would work at home, and he had a map of a plan view of the studio. And then, because the cameras they all had cables on them, he would have a piece of string on this like plastic representation of the camera, and where it plugged into the wall. And his job was to block the show without a camera ever running over another cable, because they were on wheels and they couldn't run over the cable. So that's like a very early memory of me and his workflow. But no, I only really ever wanted to be 2 things, and one was a film director and the other one was a rock and roll star. So
Right. And John Bonham was already
exactly. It was a crowded profession.
You grew up in the United Kingdom?
I did. I was born in central London on the Tottenham Court Road, and I believe we spent our early years in Notting Hill Gate, and then we moved out to what was then the country, but it was really suburbia, to a place called Bushey Heath, which is near Watford, which is where Elton John owned his football team, so that gives you a reference. And it was also situated halfway between Elstree Studios and Pinewood Studios. So for me, it was a really good place to live because I could commute to either one of those studios. You know?
And then, at what point did you leave the UK?
Well, I got my dream job, which was to work for my favorite director ever, Stanley Kubrick, on a movie called 2001: A Space Odyssey. And that was when I was 19 years old. And so I worked for like 2.5 years on that movie, which is actually the longest gainful employment that I've ever had in my life, you know, in one stretch. And at the end of that movie, I was asked by Doug Trumbull, who had originally hired me onto that movie, to come and work for his new special effects company in California. So I came right after that movie in 1968. And really, I've been here ever since. So it's my country.
Sure. At that time, what was Kubrick's, he wouldn't have been a legend, of course, at that time, as he was in his 20s or early 30s himself?
No, he was, I'm not sure what age he was, but he was definitely a legend. My dad had taken me to see Paths of Glory, which was his first big picture, I think, with Kirk Douglas. And they had these wonderful tracking shots through the World War I trenches. And it was also a courtroom drama. So I think that was his, before that he had done The Killer's Kiss and The Killing, but they were smaller movies. So I think Paths of Glory was his first, really big movie. And then, he made movies like Lolita and Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying About the Bomb and Love It. I think that's the byline of the movie. No, he for me, and because my dad had taken me to see all these movies, and then some of them I went to on my own. He was a pretty big deal. He was my favorite director. So to get hired by him on that movie was, the stars must have aligned very carefully for me to get that opportunity. And I've had some really good breaks in my life, but I've always been ready for them. I'd always laid the groundwork. So when I got the call to work on that movie, I had a very strong training in animation. So I was hired as an animation artist, and then when they found out I could shoot animation, I became especially interesting to them because there's a process in animation where the animators animate, and then the animator, they write a dope sheet, which is an instruction sheet, to tell the cameraman how to shoot it. So it's like frame by frame. It tells the cameraman what to do. So I was able to do the artwork and then put it onto the camera, and I skipped that dope sheet phase of the process. So I became very useful to them in that way, and that's how I got promoted very quickly.
Do you remember what it was like the first day you reported for the job?
Yeah, I was excited to be there, but I certainly wasn't nervous about it. It was, I think it's the arrogance of youth that you don't really know what you stepped into. And I felt very at home. I felt very supported by everybody that was around me. And, I had this background in animation. I had taught myself, I was a huge Disney fan as a kid. And when I was about 12, I wrote a book on how to animate cartoons, which was a focal press book. And I taught myself how to animate and to do cells. And then my dad bought me a 9.5 millimeter camera, which was able to take single frames. So now I was able to get my animated drawings and turn them into animated films. So I had done that. And then after school, I got hired by an animation company to be a trainee rostrum cameraman. A rostrum cameraman is the name of an animation photography process. So I had done that, and so I had this whole background that I'd been working on for years. So it seemed like I'd got this really lucky opportunity, and I jumped right into it. But I had this underlying base of knowledge and practical skill in that before I got there.
Do you remember your first meeting with Stanley Kubrick?
I do. Originally, when I came to work at MGM, we were in the front offices because the production hadn't really taken over the studio as it would within 6 months we were on every stage and every department. But at the moment that we were in this little tiny front office building, that had probably about 8 or 10 offices in it. And so I'd started off working in this room with Doug Trumbull, who had hired me, and another guy from the Film Board of Canada called Wally Gentleman. And there was Stanley just kind of like walking through the offices, and he seemed very relaxed. He was smiling and laughing and joking, and a very affable guy, and very personable. So he was, pleased to meet you, and it was. I remember it well. He came in with Arthur Clarke, who had written or co-written 2001 with him. He had written a short story that Stanley had based it on. And yeah, they were just wandering through the office. There was no like formality to it, you know. It was just, it was very nice. And Stanley's office remained open throughout the production. So you could go into his office. He had a note on his wall saying "No half-baked ideas." You know, so you don't want to come in with anything that you haven't thought about and present to him that's not a formalized plan. You know, so very interesting guy. You know.
So really an open door policy, not just what some HR paperwork says.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And you know he was, you know, he had some strange foibles to him. He liked to have nothing in his pockets. So I think he come in America. You have to carry your ID and your wallet and your car keys, and you know. So he had nothing on him. So he would bum cigarettes off other people, so he didn't have to have a pack of cigarettes on him. And he drove in this classic Rolls Royce that was at the studio, and he had a driver, but that was really the only kind of that you could call formal pretense or something that you know. And I have to say, I was a very irresponsible kid when I was on it, and I would frequently be late to work, so it would be like 9:30. And I'm coming into the parking lot, and the only other guy that's walking into the studio was Stanley, you know, and he never seemed to be angry with me for not being. So it was just like a nice, polite wave, and I'd go in. So, so it was weird because there wasn't really a pressure to work. The pressure of the work was on you, so. So it seemed like I would come in and we'd look around and we'd talk about what we'd done the day before, and then it was tea time, and then we'd have tea, and then it seemed like nothing really got done before lunch, and then round about 3 o'clock I'd start really shooting in earnest, and by the end of the day I'd got more footage shot than anybody else that was doing the same kind of work, you know. So it was the arrogance of youth, but I guess with some talent, you know.
Did you have long hair?
I did.
Nice.
Did.
Nice.
I think that's another reason I was hired. You know, said, "Oh, he looks like the Beatles. You know, we should hire him." You know.
Were you well received being so young on the set, or were there other people that were 19, 20?
No, there weren't people as young as me. I was really the youngest around. And I was very well received in our little group, but I think a lot of people in the English film industry, it's a much more kind of closed and nepotistic loop, you know, than it is here. And that was one of the great things about coming to America, was that everybody was very open about everything and invested in your success. But there was always kind of like there was always a feeling like, oh, he's maybe a little too big for his britches, you know, over there. So some, you know, the people in our department were very enthusiastic and helpful, but others were a little like, what's he doing here? You know, I'm not sure about that. You know.